Now, first things first, I want to take us back to this diagram which showcased our UI components and our Redux store. As a quick refresher, we have components on the left, we have our reducers on the right that combine into a root reducer. Actions get dispatched from our left side components, which then subsequently will update a corresponding reducer, and that reducer will combine into the root reducer state, which then gets passed to our components for them to select off of. Where does middleware fit inside this flow? Well, the first thing I need to do is make a little room. So I'm going to remove one of our components just to give us some space. And then I'm going to adjust it so that there's a little space in the top. Right there is actually where middleware sits in this flow. Actions still get dispatched from components, but before they ever make it to the reducers, they all have to pass through the middleware first. So here, let's imagine that we had our Redux logger as our only middleware. You can have multiple, but we just want to look at the one that we have, Redux logger. What happens is that, let's say you have this green circle that represents an action. This action gets dispatched from component 2 into wherever our store lives. This store, of course, now contains the Redux logger middleware, and this Redux logger receives the action. And just like any middleware, it's going to go through a sequence of steps. The first thing that it's going to do is it's going to perform some action with the action, or some logic with the action. In this particular case, it's going to log that action in that format that we saw. Then what it's going to do is it's going to call next. And what next does is next will explicitly take this action and pass it down to the remaining flow, whether it's more middleware or into the subsequent reducers, which they'll receive the action, update accordingly, and then the root reducer updates. So that is the flow that we are familiar with. Once the action enters into the reducers, we know what happens. The root reducer gets updated depending on the value returned by each individual reducer. So as I mentioned, we did this with Redux logger, which is just one middleware. But what if we had two middleware? The flow becomes the same. You have some action that dispatches from component 2. Middleware 1 receives it. It does something with it. And then what it does is it calls next once it's done. Now, it might call next when it's finished with the action, or it might do something else after next gets called. But we'll go into that a little later. The key thing you need to know about next is that the action now gets passed on, meaning that whatever comes after next is going to receive that action now. Until next gets called from this middleware, that action is not getting passed further. But now that we called next inside of middleware 1, middleware 2 receives the action, it does whatever it needs with it, it'll call next, and then this gets passed on, and as we know, the flow with the rest of our reducers, etc., etc. So now that we understand how middleware fits inside of the flow of our Redux logic, let's go back to our application and figure out why it is that our Redux logger is logging seemingly a little behind the actual updates coming from our reducers. Now here we are inside of our store.js. Inside of our store.js is where we generate our middlewares and then we add them to the store. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to write your own middleware. So first things first, I'm going to console out logger so that we can make our own logger middleware. The format of a middleware always follows the same signature. It's going to be 3 functions that return from one another. Now, if that sounds confusing, it'll make sense once I write it out. But in order for us to understand this, we need to understand the concept of currying. Now, pure and simple, currying a function is essentially a function that returns you back another function. The reason you do this is because maybe function A receives some variable A. What happens is that the return function here might use A inside of it. But what it does is it depends on maybe 2 additional properties that you pass to it as new parameters for this function. So what happens here is that if we have some curry func is equal to this, now I can say, hey, I want a new function that says with A is equal to me calling curry func, and then I pass it some value here for this placement of A. Let's say it was the number 3. Now inside what I get back for with A is going to be equal to some function where it still receives B and C. So you still can invoke this function by passing it parameters B and C. But now this value 3 is where the A was inside of the function definition. So let's say we did something with it. Let's say we added B and then we minused C, for example. What happened now is that I can say with A and then passing it 2 and 4. And now what happens is that when I call this, what's happening under the hood is it's going to take this calculation where 3 was passed in when this curried func was called. So now A is equal to 3. And then because 2 and 4 are added, well, it's going to add 2 and then subtract 4. So through this, you're able to create this function creator that is actually very dynamic. We can use curry func to make a bunch of different functions. This should, say with 3. I can make another one with 10, which is equal to curry func passing the 10 value. And now again, I can say with 10, and then I can pass it different values. It's really just a function generator, and it allows us to create reusable function. And in our particular case, with middleware, we're creating reusable middleware functions. Now, these are chained create functions. So what happens is that the first function receives the store object. This in turn returns another function that receives the next method, as we saw, the thing that allows us to pass on the action. Then the next function this returns receives the action. And then finally, inside of here is where we write our middleware signature. So this is where we write the code that we want our middleware to do. Now, let's think about what we want this middleware to do. Because all we want to do is very clearly just simply log out the appropriate action so we see what's happening. We're just duplicating this logger that we had before. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I just want to make sure that if there's no action type, it doesn't come from us sometimes. Sometimes you might receive an action that we may not need to receive. This is oftentimes possible when you're working with things like Redux Thunk and whatever. We're just accounting for that. If you're unfamiliar with Redux Thunk, I'll explain it in a later video when we cover Redux Thunk. For now, just understand there are times with external additional middleware that you pass, you may receive actions that don't have types on them. If that happens, don't worry. We'll just say, hey, I'm assuming this is not for me. I'm just going to pass this along. So we call next.action. We're done. We return from this middleware. Nothing happens afterwards. But if there is an action type on it, then we want to console log it. So first what I'm going to say is console log the type. And this is going to also show action type. And I also want to console log the payload. So we see what we're logging. And again, action.payload. Now here, what I want to do is I want to console log the current state. So I'm going to say current state. And here I'm just going to put store.getState. GetState will give us back the value of the state right now. At this point, this looks like the first half of the logger, which is where it shows us the action and it shows us the previous state. But what it needs to show us is the next state. So how do you derive the next state? Well, it turns out the only way that the logger can actually get this is from the store object. But how does the store actually get us the new state? Well, it will only get us the new state if it's updated once it's run through all of the reducers with the action. And this is where we need to say, hey, I want to call next on the action. I want to pass the action along now. And what I'm waiting for is when that action finally hits the reducers and updates, because all of this is happening synchronously. The moment this next call happens, action gets passed on, subsequent middleware will all run, reducers will all run, and then only when that is complete will any code after this next fire. So here, if now we say console.log next state, like so, and here, if we recall store.getState, this is where we now see what the new state will be. And this is what we want to pass into our middlewares. So let's go back to our application and see this in action. So now when I refresh, what you will see is that we have a different order. We have our original category component rendering for the first time. Our selector, of course, fires. And then you notice that the effect fires. But look what happens now. The effect fire called set products, but we're not actually updating anything. Our set current user action now dispatches because, again, our auth listener is hooked up. The user object comes in, and we see inside of our new logger middleware, which is inside of store.js that we just wrote, we see that we get our user set current state and we get the payload. We get the current state. And now what you notice is that our selector fired and our re-render is triggering on this component. The reason why we see this from our category component firing is again because right after this log, this next happens. And as I mentioned, this is synchronous. So this action is now being passed to all the next subsequent middleware and all of the reducers. Only when all this update does finally our next state console log that happens on line 17 after this happened. But remember, the moment reducers run, all of our use selector methods are getting called. So before we ever hit this line, this next call is updating our reducers, which is updating our store object, which in turn is calling use selector on all of our components. Even though the user is the one that's updating, as I mentioned, this use selector is still going to run anywhere, regardless of what you're trying to select off of. Now, that is why before with the logger, you were seeing it fire that log after all of our component code had updated from the reducers being updated. Now, the reason why here it's a lot more clear and broken up is because we're not grouping those logs together. Redux Logger is taking the entirety of all these individual logs that we're making and then bundling into one log. Whereas as you notice, we're literally logging every single step so that we can synchronously see what's happening. Redux Logger doesn't do that. So this is one of those things you just got to know about debugging with Redux Logger, is that you got to think about the actions and when they fire. And then if you see the Redux Logger, sometimes it may be in conflict with when inside of your functional components and then with your useSelect hook, maybe there is some weirdness in the timing. Now, of course, you can just really easily write your own logger middleware as we've done, but we also get one from Redux Logger if you're comfortable with it. It's a very, very popular middleware, so that's why I'm showing it to you as well. But I also wanted to demystify middleware so that you really see it's really not that complicated. You just have something that wants to generate side effects with actions before it hits your reducers. And you can do that inside of this middleware. And again, all it is just a sequence of create functions. And there we go. Now we see what we get with this logger middleware. We understand why this is happening. We can just keep this for now while we continue debugging the remainder of this pattern that we're emerging from using selectors inside of our components. So hopefully this clarifies middlewares and loggers for you. In the next video, we'll talk about how we can optimize some of our re-rendering that's happening in our category component. I'll see you in the next video.